Okay, excellent. I think it's streaming. Is it? Oh, yes. Excellent. We're going to go with yes. Welcome. There we go. We're starting the recording device too. Very cool. Excellent. Welcome. This is the 22nd of April. This is for you students who are on Zoom. Remember, tomorrow we have a test. It's going to be great. This is your last lecture of AP World History. What? I know. It's your last lecture of AP World History, so enjoy it thoroughly. Okay? Ready? 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 Um, our title for today is 20th Century Reforms. Okay? A reform is trying to solve a problem, right? If you're reforming something, you're recognizing a problem and then trying to solve it. So before we talk about 20th century reforms, we're going to talk about 20th century problems, right? What problems are going on? In the time period after 1900, many people were treated unfairly. This isn't new to the 20th century, right? This is a continuity throughout world history. We can look at discrimination against different ethnic groups, different gender group. We can look at different race groups. We can look at different income groups, right? This is a continuity throughout world history. Unequal social status, unequal political rights, less access to goods, less economic opportunity. But in large part, many of these problems that still exist in the 20th century, people try to solve them in new ways in the 20th century, and there are new waves of problem solving, and that's why we're looking at it in Unit 9 as well, because we've got a new set of solutions to many of these age-old problems. Okay, so real quick, we're going to check in with what some of these problems look like, get some clear definitions so that as we move forward through lecture, we have a clear understanding of what we're talking about and how we're moving forward. Okay, race problems. Race, we're talking about skin color. This is a long-term continuity, right? Many areas of the world feature race discrimination. We see especially the roots of this in colonialism, right? In all the places where the European countries took over, we have domination of white Europeans over whatever indigenous peoples are there. Because the Europeans were the most technologically advanced and they were the ones to conquer, this ideology of Europeans being superior, being in charge, is where many of these race problems start at. In the 19th century, in the 20th century, in the 1900s, even though most empires become liberated by the end, right? There's very few colonies left. There are still persisting and surviving attitudes of racism that go on. Problems with gender. In many societies, this is another long-term continuity, right? Women are seen as second to men. Women have less political rights, have lower social standing, have less opportunities economically. Class. Class is social status, right? So sometimes related to your race, sometimes related to your gender, sometimes not. Often class is really highly tied to your economic status. Rich people have more social liberty. Poor people are less desirable socially. People don't like them. And sometimes that's reinforcing, right? If your dad is a lawyer and you're really rich, you might have high social class. You go to the opera, you get to go to Disneyland 5 times a year. You're upper class. And then because your dad is rich, you then have more opportunities to go to college and to continue being rich. If you're from a lower class, your family maybe has poor economic status, you can't afford to go do entertainment things that other people might afford to do. And then your family's poor, so they can't send you to college. And so you get a low paying job and that gets perpetuated. So often class is a multi-generational thing. And problems with religion, another long-term continuity in world history, right? Minority religions are often persecuted. Diversity and cooperative diversity in societies among people of different religions is an exception. It's usually not the rule. Usually there's some sort of discrimination. Even in societies where we see different religions living together, a classic example, the Ottoman Empire, right? There's a steady Christian population in the Ottoman Empire, but they're routinely discriminated against. Their sons are taken for the Devshirme system. They have to pay an extra tax because of their religion. Okay, so these are problems that have been continuous throughout world history, right? If someone were to ask you a question to describe a continuity in social standing in world history, you could say discrimination against people of minority religious statuses, right? Continuity. In the 1900s, We're about 150 years deep into the Enlightenment, and a lot of these Enlightenment ideas are what lead to changes in trying to solve problems, right? A few key ideas that come out of the Enlightenment that play a big role here. The social contract, remember that's by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Here's a picture of him over here. Jean-Jacques Rousseau says that societies are based on social contracts. Governments are social contracts, right? A contract, an agreement. The government agrees to protect your rights and you agree to obey the government. If the government isn't protecting your rights, then you can rightfully stop obeying the government, have a revolution, and try and overthrow it, right? 150 years deep into this Enlightenment thought, a lot of people believe in this. They say the government needs to protect our rights, and if it doesn't, then we are justified in not obeying that government and in trying to change it. So people see their government as a social contract and one that is changeable. This idea of popular sovereignty, that the people should have political power, the people should have power to change their government, especially through voting. In societies where we have popular sovereignty, where people are allowed to vote, then all you have to do to change the laws in that society are change what people think and believe, right? If people think and believe something, if we change the culture of society, then those people will go to the polls, they will vote, and they will change the laws in that country. We see that here in the United States. Well, we're getting ahead of ourselves. But in the 1920s, in the 19-teens, when people started to believe more that women should be able to make their own choices, they went, they voted, they gave women the right to vote, and then women were able to vote and change more laws, right? In countries with popular sovereignty, if you can change what people believe, if you can change their culture, their belief system, then they will vote differently and they will change the laws themselves. One more thing, a constitution. Many states during this time period have a constitution, and if they don't have a constitution, they want a constitution. A constitution is a written document that outlines how the government works, how laws are made, and how things can be changed. Okay, Constitution is a written document that lays out how things work in the government. Okay, this means that the government is systematic, right? If you want to change something in the government, go read the Constitution, find out how to change it, make that change happen, and you'll be good to go. It's not arbitrary rule. The king doesn't get to make up what he wants to happen. The ruling class doesn't get to make up new rules. Everyone is supposed to follow the Constitution. Again, this makes it easier for people to change things. If they want a reform to happen, they get their Constitution, they read through it, they figure out what steps they need to take, and then they move forward and make those changes. Excellent. So all these things taken together, the Enlightenment gives a blueprint in how to effectuate change. Once cultural and social opinions change, people go on to change their government, either through overthrowing a government that's broken the social contract or through using popular sovereignty and the constitutions that exist to change government in ways that have already been predetermined. So throughout this lecture, as we're looking at solving these problems, watch for a change in society and culture first, and then that change in society and culture is followed by a change in government, a change in legal practices. How does this fit into our Unit 9 about globalization? This fits into globalization because people are more connected. Here's our map, right? Showing that people are more connected, especially with communications and information technology, right? Now, if something big changes in Brazil, people in Mexico can learn about it right away, right? We're more connected. It's easier to learn about things. So that means that things have a greater effect on each other. If the culture and laws are changing in Brazil, people in Mexico are going to find out about them, and maybe they're going to say, hey, let's make that same change, right? Because they learn about news that's happening in other countries, they adopt that quicker. Change spreads faster. So once one country takes a step to end racial discrimination, it makes it more popular for other countries to take that step. Once one country gives women the right to vote, women in other countries find out about that. It becomes popular there, and it's easier to make that change there. So globalization increases the speed with which reforms take place. Excellent. We need a new slide. There we go. Excellent. So we're going to go through, right? We talked about these different categories. We're going to go through these categories one by one. We're going to look at how race reforms were made in the 20th century, how gender reforms were made in the 20th century, etc., etc. Okay. So we're going to start off with race. Reforming race situations, how to make, what's that word? how to right some of the injustices that are going. We're going to start off with an example from the United States. So from the founding of the United States in 1772, the United States practiced African slavery, right? African slavery was established before the creation of the United States. So this is the discrimination that's built in to that country. The U.S. is also founded with a constitution, right? A document that says, here's how the government works, here's how you can change what the laws are. The Constitution can be changed in the United States if 75% of voters, especially of state voters, vote to change it. So if 75% of people in the United States vote to change the Constitution, then the Constitution will be changed. Related to race, this happened in a big way in the 1960s. There were 3 amendments to the Constitution, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments. These amendments said, respectively, the 13th Amendment said slavery is illegal in the United States. No one can be a slave in the United States. The 14th Amendment says everyone who's born in the United States is a citizen of the United States, right? All the slaves by this point, by 1860, had been born in the United States. The U.S. slave trade was abolished much earlier, so all the slaves that were there had been born there. So the 14th Amendment says those slaves, not only are they free now, they're citizens. The 15th Amendment says if you're a citizen of the United States, you can vote in the United States. So 13th, 14th Amendment says we're freeing the slaves, they are citizens, they can vote. And this happens in the 19th century, in the 1800s. So post this, slavery is illegal, blacks are citizens, they're allowed to vote. Even though legally this has changed, attitudes of racism still persist for another 100 years. And in the 1960s in the United States, there's a civil rights movement. Civil rights are the rights that people have as citizens. So the civil rights movement, leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Thurgood Marshall, pointed out and they said, even though African Americans have the right to vote in the United States, many of them do not vote because they're scared of getting hurt if they vote the wrong way. They pointed out that African Americans were mistreated. They were often segregated from other people, and especially from the white population, that they had the poor quality of goods. And that laws like poll taxes, money that you have to pay to be able to vote, or literacy tests, a test that you have to take if you're going to vote, ended up disenfranchising blacks, taking away their right to vote. And other discriminatory practices that made it difficult to be black in America. So these leaders, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Thurgood Marshall, pointed out these racial inequalities. They said it's not fair that black students have to go to a different school with old textbooks while white students get to go to a better school with newer textbooks. That's not fair. And they point out in large scale these racial injustices. Martin Luther King Jr., he's up here in the top right-hand corner of our screen. He widely appeals to both black and white audiences. And he says, if you're a Christian, you can't be in favor of segregation. He says it's against the teachings of Jesus. And he gets a lot of support from many different racial communities, a lot of bilateral support. Malcolm X down here on the bottom in black and white was a leader in the Nation of Islam, so a different religious group, but got a lot of black power support and emphasized that black people have strength and should not settle for less than what they deserve. I don't have a picture of Thurgood Marshall on here, but he worked with the NAACP. That stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Thurgood Marshall was a really great lawyer, and he litigated or took to court a lot of cases that proved that black people were mistreated in the United States. And before the courts, he argued that black people should have more access to the same rights and should have better conditions in the United States. So these key civil rights leaders popularized this idea that it was unfair to African American citizens and that things should change. These leaders, Martin Luther King was not in the government. Malcolm X was not in the government. They're not government leaders, but they got massive multiracial support and they changed the society and the culture of the United States, right? We celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day. That's a holiday. That's part of our culture. They changed the culture of the United States, and then as a result, citizens in the United States voted and changed the laws in the United States. A key example of a law that was passed is the 1965 Civil Rights Act. So it's passed in 1965 in the middle of the Civil Rights Movement, and this law says government agencies And businesses that are open to the public, that means restaurants, that means stores, that means schools on the government side. Any place that you can go after school is probably somewhere that's open to the public. These businesses cannot discriminate on the basis of race. It says that we're done having a separate store for Black citizens and a separate store for white students. We're done having separate drinking fountains, separate bathrooms, separate buses. The 1965 Civil Rights Act says that you cannot discriminate or separate people or treat them differently based on their race. It also says that you can't treat people differently based on their gender, their sex, or their religion. Okay. As a result of the 1965 right, by and large, segregation ended in the United States, at least legal and official segregation ended, and many African Americans were able to vote again. The Civil Rights Act has a section on voting rights that says you can't make people pay a poll tax, you can't make people pay a literacy test. So those obstacles were removed, and many African Americans were re-enfranchised, were restored to their rights to be able to vote. Excellent. Even though, so we've got this, right? We can see a progression. 1860s, legally slavery is over, right? That's a big step up in your quality of life. You're not a slave anymore. 1960s, civil rights movement. You're no longer segregated. Our society is not segregated. Another big step up. Even though we've had these huge steps up, things are still not equal. I'm talking like 1980s, 1990s, things were still not equal for African American citizens. And specifically, statistics showed that African American students underperformed in school, generally had lower paying jobs, didn't have as much representation in professions like being a lawyer or being a doctor. There are more white lawyers proportionally than Black lawyers. Why is that? So people pointed out that there was still this discrimination, still this discrepancy in achievement. And so later on, something else that was developed to try and combat this is affirmative action. They said, legally, there's no slavery. Legally, everyone who's a citizen has the same rights. Legally, we're not allowed to discriminate, and yet we still see these differences in outcome. So affirmative action is a program that is designed to try and rectify that, try and change those differences in outcome. Affirmative action is when universities guarantee, so colleges guarantee that a certain percentage of their students will be from a certain race. So maybe the University of Arizona says, we guarantee that at least 12% of our student body will be Black. Okay. The difference from how it used to be, so before affirmative action, they said, we will take the top 200 most successful students, right? We're going to give you an entrance exam. The 200 students that score the highest on this entrance exam will be able to come to our university, right? And therefore, students with the high scores go, students with the low scores don't. With affirmative action, they say, we're still going to look at scores, but we're going to make sure that at least 10% of our population is Black. What this means and how this played out is this means that, so let's say 1,000 people took the test, and the top 200 scores for the 200 spots that are supposed to get in the class, maybe 190 of those were from white students, 10 of those were from Black students. But if the university is following a program of affirmative action, they say, no, we need at least 20 Black students. So that means 10 Black students who actually scored lower will get to go to the university, and 10 white students who scored higher will not get to go to the university. So affirmative action means that even if it doesn't match up with the scores, we're going to guarantee that there's a spot for minority students in the university. This has two effects. One, it increases the amount of diversity at universities, right? It increases the Black population at universities, the Hispanic population at universities. Effect number two, it creates backlash, right? Those 10 white students that scored high enough to get in, but didn't get in because they weren't part of this racial quota, they get angry, their families get angry. They say that's not fair. And in some cases, it hurts the reputation of Black students because some people say, are you here because you scored high enough, or are you here because the university just needs enough African American students? So in some ways, it increases the discrimination, at least on a social level, between Black students. Excellent. Excellent. That's what I have to say about this. Top notch. We will see affirmative action show up again later in the lecture. Okay. What does it mean? Affirmative action is when a university or some other institution has a racial quota. They say this much of our percentage is going to come from this minority group. Its effects, it increases diversity. Sometimes it has a negative effect too, though. People feel like it's unfair, and sometimes it leads to greater discrimination. That's our United States example. Yeah? Here's our example from South Africa, and we've already talked about this previously. So our setup, where did racial discrimination come from in Africa? Africa, people native to Africa are black, right? Excellent. South Africa, the southern tip of Africa, was a settler colony. We learned about this in the 1700s, 1800s. Many Dutch and English sailors settled there, right? People who were part of the VOC or part of the British East India Company, when they got old, they said, I'm British, but I've spent my whole life in the ocean. I've been in South Africa more than I've been in England. I'm just going to live in South Africa for the rest of my life. And we see a lot of settlers move to South Africa. So we have a big white population that shows up in South Africa because it's a settler colony. As in most places, a general attitude of racism and lack of cooperation develops in South Africa. And that makes sense, right? The black population of South Africa is there because they've always been there. The white population of South Africa is there because they settled there, because maybe there used to be sailors. They have different cultural backgrounds. They're there for different purposes. They make money different ways. And so they generally kept separate, segregated. There was not a lot of reason for them to move in and work together, so they didn't. So in general, we have a long history of segregation in South Africa. It gets legally codified. So before, it was just something that was happening, right? White people were like, we're just going to live over here in this white section. And Africans said, yeah, we're going to live over here in this African section. Great. It gets legally codified, part of the law code, in the 1940s and the 1960s, and it's called apartheid. So in the early 1900s, there had started to be more mixing between the white and the black populations, and some people in government thought that was inappropriate, and so they created laws that made it illegal to have racial mixing, that white people couldn't marry black people. They couldn't intermarry. They couldn't own businesses together. They couldn't work together. So this is called apartheid, the legal segregation of the races in South Africa. Laws that are specifically designed and specifically worded to create segregation. Okay? And in South Africa, because of this, we see a lot of segregation and political differences similar to what we see in the United States. It's really interesting, right? This gets put in place in the 1940s to the 1960s at the same time the U.S. is trying to desegregate. So the U.S. tries to desegregate while South Africa moves towards greater segregation. A little bit wild. We have two political parties that come into play here. The National Party, or the NP, is the white party. It's entirely white. They make up the majority of the government in the mid-1900s through the late 1900s. The National Party is the party that's in charge of passing these apartheid laws, these segregation laws. African National Congress is the other political party. They allowed all races to join, but they had a majority of black members of their party. African National Congress, or the ANC, so they allow any race to join, but they're largely black. The African National Congress, even though they're a political party, they're not actually in government. They're a political party, right? It's a group of people with ideas about what the government should be like, but according to apartheid laws, because it's a majority black party, they're not even allowed to be in government. So they do a lot of protesting and demonstrating, even though they don't have actual political power. They're trying, through protesting and demonstrating, to change the culture of South Africa, right? They say if we protest enough, if we demonstrate enough, people will see us, they will recognize us, they will start to think that this is a good idea, this is a good party, this is people we should support. They're trying to change the culture. Initially, they do a lot of peaceful demonstrations, peaceful protests, much like what's going on in the United States. They move on and start to use more violent tactics as well. And when they start to use more violent tactics and start to riot, they get cracked down on. The National Party and the government makes the African National Congress illegal. They imprison party leaders, and party membership has to go underground. By that I mean secret, right? So people are members of the African National Congress, but they have to keep it secret. They don't tell other people about it. It's a clandestine organization, and most of the leaders are in jail including Mr. Nelson Mandela. So Nelson Mandela is the president of the African National Congress. He gets jailed for his participation in the country. However, even though the National Party is cracking down against the African National Congress, is cracking down and imposing more segregation around the world, and especially in the United States, the trend is for integration, for desegregation. And globalism comes into play here. The leaders in Africa and the people in Africa hear more and more about desegregation in the United States and in other parts of the world, and it starts to gain popularity, and the society of South Africa starts to shift. This major shift happens in the 80s and 90s, and in the 1990s, President of South Africa, President F.W. de Klerk, is the president of South Africa. He's a member of the National Party, but he goes and he signs off on the release of Nelson Mandela from prison. Nelson Mandela, the president of the African National Congress, gets released from prison. By doing this, F.W. de Klerk is showing it's okay to have the African National Congress. It's okay to have that political party. And F.W. de Klerk goes on not just to release Nelson Mandela from prison, but to remove apartheid laws and to allow Black people to vote in African elections, in South African elections, for the first time. In 1995, that's like I was alive in 1995. In 1995, for the first time, Africa holds an election. South Africa holds their election where Black people are allowed to vote. And in that election, Nelson Mandela is elected the president of South Africa. As president, Nelson Mandela helped to draft a new constitution for South Africa that was racially inclusive, that allowed for Black people to have just as much participation in the government as whites in South Africa. Excellent. I'm going to take a drink break in case you need to write stuff down. Excellent. Gender. Excellent. Again, we're going to start off with the United States. So we're looking at problems of gender discrimination, and in general, our usual topic is that women are treated as lesser than, have less rights as citizens than men do generally. We're looking in the U.S. This is true in the United States. Like most places, women have less rights. We have a few different waves of feminism. We have 3 distinct waves of feminism. We're just going to talk about 2 today as part of our discussion of world history. First wave feminism happens in the 1800s until 1920. So from the 1800s until 1900. That's what this picture down here is. From that time period. The main goal of first wave feminism is to gain political rights for women to have the same political rights as men, specifically suffrage. Suffrage means the right to vote. Suffrage means the right to vote. Suffrage is a good thing. Suffrage is not suffering. They sound the same, they are not the same. Suffrage, good. Suffering, bad. Suffrage, the right to vote. Suffrage is the right to vote. So women in first wave feminism are after political rights, including suffrage, the right to vote, also the right to own private property, and the right to run for political office. I'm giving you a list of a few key leaders here and organizations in this feminist movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, someone forgot to put a comma in here. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she's one person. Susan B. Anthony is another person. Both of these women work in the 1800s. To get women's rights to vote. They're largely successful in getting rights to vote in different states. Alice Paul works in the 19-teens during World War I, in fact. She is successful in helping women across the United States have the right to vote in presidential elections. And then 2 significant organizations, the National American Women's Suffrage Organization and the National Woman's Party, are born during this time. What did these women do? They had demonstrations, they had parades where they'd hold signs, right? Protests. Here we see some women marching. You can see they're all wearing white. They're holding up a sign that shows their cause. They would have speeches. They would have protests. Why all this stuff? To change the culture, right? They said, we recognize that we can't change the laws, We have to change what men think about women's right to vote so that those men will vote and change the laws. So they have these demonstrations, these protests, these speeches, these events to change the culture of the United States, to make voting and political rights for women seem acceptable. And then as a result of that, by changing cultural perceptions, by changing the opinions that men have about women voting, those men went and voted and passed another amendment, the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote and to hold office. Once the 19th Amendment is passed and women are allowed to vote, then women vote and they help create further laws that change policy and create political equality between gender. Excellent. We say that first wave feminism largely ends in 1920 because women get the right to vote, right? Once women get the right to vote, they're like, hey, we did it. Excellent. We've got political rights. Good job, women suffragists. Good job, feminism. We're good to go. After the 1920s, we've got the Great Depression, World War II. Those things are kind of a big deal. And the women's issue doesn't come up until after World War II is largely settled in the 1960s. And we get this development of second wave feminism. Second wave feminism, our time period there is roughly the 1960s to the 1990s in the United States. The main goal of second wave feminism is to achieve economic and social equality with men. Right? First wave feminism is all about political equality. Second wave feminism is about economic equality, social equality. Okay. So for example, women were not equally represented in the workforce. And when women did have jobs, they were often paid less than men and treated differently and unfairly from men. Some key leaders we have in the second wave feminist group are Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem. Yes, excellent. Both of these women are not only leaders, but they're authors. They write books, right? They're writing books. They're appealing to women. They're trying to change what women think about being women, what women think about their rights in society, their role in society, right? They're trying to change that culture first. Excellent. Second wave feminism did have some success. In that 1965 Civil Rights Act that we talked about in the last slide, that act says that you can't discriminate based on race. It also says that you cannot discriminate based on sex or gender. So in that 1965 Civil Rights Act, it guarantees that women won't be discriminated against based on their sex. And the same affirmative action programs that guarantee a certain percentage of Black students or a certain percentage of Hispanic students, there's also female affirmative action, right? Programs by universities to guarantee that a certain percentage of their students will be women. Same thing. Affirmative action has the effect of increasing the diversity of a university. It also creates some backlash, right? So if a university says, we guarantee 40% of our students will be women, and then some men lose their place who would have scored high enough to get in, they don't like that. And then discrimination against women. People will say, did you get the scholarship because you deserved it, or did you get the scholarship because you're a girl? Right? Questioning of whether or not you got it because you got the score or because the school needed to meet their quota. Yeah, excellent. So those were two examples of success, right? Civil Rights Act makes sex discrimination illegal. Affirmative action increases women representation in the workforce and in educational programs. This other bullet point I have up here, the Equal Rights Amendment, is something that feminists tried to get passed as a law. They were not successful. The Equal Rights Amendment is a proposed amendment that would change the Constitution, but it does not get enough support. The Equal Rights Amendment proposed to make men and women 100% equal in United States law. It had a lot of popularity, but not enough to pass. Some of the people who disagreed with it, in fact, its biggest opponents were other women, and they disagreed with it on some points. For example, it would make women forced to serve in the military during the Vietnam War. And a lot of women said, no, I don't want to be forced to serve in the military. I will be fine. If men have to get forced and women don't have to get forced, I'm going to be just fine with it not being equal. So a lot of women who criticized it and were against it ultimately had enough power to make sure that that Equal Rights Amendment did not pass. Those are our United States examples. Next bullet point, I have the dates for international women's suffrage. So women in the United States were allowed to vote in 1920. Remember, we're in a globalist world where there's increased communication, increased technology that allows for information to be spread faster. This leads to cultural changes. So when the U.S. gives women the right to vote, other countries find about it. That gives increased energy and drive for the feminist organizations there, and it becomes popular in other countries, and then those countries change their laws, right? You change the culture, you change the laws. So in 1932, Brazil gave women the right to vote. In 1934, Turkey gave women the right to vote. 1945, Japan. 1947, India. 1963, Morocco. Okay. Do all countries allow women to vote today? No. In fact, there are some very anti-women countries out there, or at least anti-women suffrage countries out there. And we've seen a little bit of an increase of them, right? Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, as they're trying to take over areas in Afghanistan and the Middle East, are generally anti-women voting and anti-women having legal rights. So it's not a one solid trajectory towards women having more rights. There are organizations and political parties out there that are anti-women's rights. Excellent. Last thing I have on this slide, Madres de la Plaza de Mayo is in Argentina. It's a women's movement. So this is a specific women's movement. It's different than the women's movement in the United States, right? The women's movement in the United States is about making sure women have more rights. The women's movement in the Plaza de Mayo is not about making sure women have more rights. It is an organization of women that are working towards a different goal, but it shows the political strength, or at least the social strength, that women can have in different countries. Okay, so back up. Think about what we talked about with Pinochet in Chile. Remember, we said that he was a right-wing dictator in Chile. He was supported by the United States. He took over after he helped coup Salvador Allende, the socialist, right? And then he sets up this dictatorship, and he's really cracks down, imprisons people, executes people, has people disappeared who disagree with him, right? That was Augusto Pinochet. We've got basically the same thing in Argentina, but the dictator's name is Jorge Rafael Videla. Okay, so Videla is the Argentinian dictator. In a military dictatorship, he's super anti-communist. Therefore, during the Cold War, he gets support from the United States. But like Pinochet, Videla is violent and harsh, cracks down against dissidents, especially left-leaning or communist dissidents. So people who disagree with him and support communism get treated harshly by the government. Argentina is our most well-known southern cone dictatorship, right? Southern cone, the bottom half of South America, kind of cone-shaped. And as a dictatorship, as his government, they're responsible for disappearing 30,000 people. So 30,000 people that disagreed with the government or that had some sort of communist tie were disappeared. As in, they went to work or they went to school and they just didn't come back. And no one knows where they went, disappeared. Enter the families of these disappeared people, right? So these people, most of them were young, some of them were middle-aged. They disappear and they never come back. Their families are unhappy. Their mothers began to gather. And this is the beginning of the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo. Madres means mothers in Spanish. So the mothers of these disappeared people began to gather. Under the Videla government, women were seen as not political. Women couldn't have political opinions or political power. And so women got away with doing a little more protest, right? These women would gather, they'd talk about their missing children, they'd ask where their missing children were. But if the government said, this is a political movement, they'd say, no, it's not, we're women. We can't be a political movement because we're only women. So they kind of got away from it. They started to gather every Friday. All these mothers who had lost their children, they didn't know where their children went. And children, like their 20, 30-year-old children, but their biological children, right, had disappeared. They start to gather every Friday outside the Pink House or outside the president's house in Argentina. They brought pictures of their disappeared children. They made signs that just talked about their disappeared children. You can see here on their head coverings, they would stitch in information about their children that were missing. They'd say, oh, this isn't a political sign. This is just my head covering. This is just what I wear. It's just my clothes. It's not political. It's just my clothes. And they met every Friday. They still meet every Friday. They started doing this in the 80s. They still meet today. You can still go to Argentina and see the mothers meet in the Plaza de Mayo because their children are still missing. And so they do this. This demonstrates their meeting every Friday for 1 hour outside the National House, demonstrates a long-term resentment of Videla's junta, right? They're showing and they're changing the culture slowly and surely. They protest in a way that other people couldn't, right? Because they're women. If men had done this, the men would get imprisoned. But women could get away with this because they said, "Oh, it's not political. We're just women. We're just meeting to gossip." But really, they were meeting to protest this dictatorship. As these women began to meet every Friday, they gained attention. People noticed they were doing this. They gained international attention, and Videla eventually lost popularity and was moved out of government. Right? These women, even though they didn't have political power, changed the social perception, the cultural perception of the Videla dictatorship, and eventually helped to end it. That's why it's here on our women's movement. So even though they didn't fight for women's rights, they're a movement made up entirely of women that made a difference in the political course of Argentina. So even though Videla isn't in charge of Argentina, they still meet today because their kids are still missing. For the most part, people that disappeared in Argentina, there's no records of where they went. People don't know. And it's a bad deal. That's that. Excellent. Sorry that's depressing. We have one more slide that's less depressing. So that's good. Ready? I'll take a drink in case you're catching up there. Okay, excellent. Our last two categories that we talked about, we're going to talk about them together, class and religion. And our example comes from India, where we see example of both class discrimination and religious discrimination. Remember, we're going to back up. We're doing some review here. India has a strict caste system. This is a continuity throughout all of world history. We talked about this in Unit 1. It's Unit 9. We're still here. India has a strict caste system. Remember, it's ancient. It's tied to Hinduism. It's a long-term continuity. I have our little map here, right here. At the top of the caste system, we have Brahmins. They're the highest level of society. They're the priests. Kshatriyas, they're a second level. They're the warriors. Vaishyas, those are the middle people. Merchants, people who own land, the middle class. And then down on the bottom, Shudras, peasants, people who don't own lands, who do work. And then below the bottom, a class of untouchable people, people who are so low class that no one even wants to touch them. If you touch them, you lose social standing. Excellent. And so we've talked about this caste system before. It's rigid. There's no mixing. If you're a Shudra, you're going to marry a Shudra. Your kids are going to be Shudra. Your grandparents were Shudras. If you're Kshatriya, you're going to marry Kshatriya. Your kids are going to be Kshatriyas. Your grandparents were Kshatriyas. That's how you're going to be forever. So it's a really rigid caste system. All right, so we've got strict class system. There's also some measure of religious diversity in India, right? Even though Pakistan was created, some Muslims still stayed in India. And because India spent so long under British colonization, there's a somewhat sizable Christian population in India too, right? People who converted to the British religion while the British were in charge. Some of them stayed Christian even when India became independent. Okay, so in India, we have a rigid caste system. We have a majority Hindu. We have low-class people. We have a few Muslims. We have a few Christian people. In general, religious minorities like Christians and Muslims and the low castes, Shudras, and the untouchables were blocked from social mobility, from education, from jobs. If you're a Shudra, you might not be able to get into a school in India. If you're a Christian, you might not be able to get into a school in India. If you're a Muslim, you might not be able to get a good job. If you're a Shudra, you definitely can't get a good job, right? Part of being a Shudra is that you have a bad job. Part of being an untouchable is that you have a bad job. So people's caste and their religion created a big barrier to whether or not they were allowed to have educational opportunities or jobs. So we see, we're looking at right reform movements. How did people try and change this? How do they try and end this and create greater opportunities for people of different religions, people of lower castes? This actually starts while the British are still in charge of India. So during the late 1800s, early 1900s, the British try and change some of this. Remember, the Europeans, one of the reasons they colonized places was because they felt they had a civilizing mission. They needed to help people be more civilized, more like Europeans, less like their native ways. So they said, India is a British colony. We've got to try and make sure that we've got better living conditions and more opportunities for them. As part of this, Britain, remember, in some of their laws, I think there's like a 1930 Government of India law. They said we're going to let some of the Indians help make laws for India. In that program where they're letting Indians make laws for India, they say we're going to guarantee space for people from lower classes. We're going to guarantee that some of the Shudras have a role in making laws for Indians. Kind of like affirmative action. The British said we're going to make sure that Shudras and Vaishyas are included in the lawmaking system of India, as well as Brahmins and Kshatriyas. Excellent. After the 1947 independence movement in India, there are similar programs at play, specifically the reservation system. It's called the reservation system in India. Reservation system in India is like affirmative action in the United States. They set quotas for the amount of people from lower classes and from minority religions for government jobs and for education. They said in the government we will have at least 15% of our employees be from the Shudra population, at least 15% from the Vaishya population. We're going to make sure that these people get included in government jobs. Same thing in education. We're going to guarantee that at least 5% of the students at schools are Christian. We're going to guarantee that at least 5% of students at school are Muslim. So we're going to guarantee that people have a place in government systems and in educational systems. Just like in the US with affirmative action, the results are twofold. One, there's increased diversity, right? There's more lower class people in the government in India. There's more opportunities for Shudras to be able to socially climb. Lower classes get more opportunities. Religious minorities get more opportunities. However, there's also a backlash, right? If you're a Shudra, you only have to score a 75% instead of an 85% because they need more Shudras in the government. So because the expectations are lower, sometimes Shudras have a lower expectation, a lower reputation, right? People say, are you here because you're actually smart enough to be here? Or are you here because they needed more Shudras in the government? There's this backlash and then this increase of discrimination. And that's that. Here's our reservation system. Excellent. What did we do today? We looked at these different problems. We looked at how race discrimination tried to get solved in the 20th century. We looked at how gender discrimination tried to get solved in the 20th century, how class and religious discrimination tried to be addressed and solved in the 20th century. Were these movements successful? In some ways, yeah. We've got much greater diversity, much more representation than we did before, but there's still lingering problems. You know, because you live in the United States in 2021, that this is still something that we're talking a lot about, something that people have strong opinions about, something that makes a big difference for people, and that is going to continue to shape our society and our political life into the future. It'll be exciting. It's so great. It's like world history is helping you better navigate the world you live in. Oh my gosh, so cool. Excellent. Students, great job. This has been our last lecture of AP World History. I hope you feel like you've accomplished something because you have, and I think you are incredible. Remember, we have a test tomorrow. It's going to be great. I'll see you then.